I was shivering in the chilly night air as I stood outside the house I'd worked so hard to buy, abruptly cut off from the same people who claimed to love me. Margaret's cold voice emerged from behind the door. "You no longer own this house, Grace. It's Trevor's home now." My heart ached, but I grew more determined. I knew I had to protect both my own future and that of my pregnant child. "My name is Grace Thompson, and I am 34 years old. My life's work has been to become an investment analyst, a career I'm proud of, and I'm content with my independence." It was not easy after years of hard work. My dream house in Austin, a stunning residence that symbolized my achievements, cost me $7 million. It was my sanctuary until Trevor Harrison, the man I had once loved and trusted, upended my entire life. Trevor, a 37-year-old software programmer, captivated me with his brains and charm. I didn't realize how tragic our wedding day would be, even though it was beautiful and full of hope. When Trevor's mother, Margaret, a 63-year-old retired college professor, began to interfere in our affairs, everything had changed. Margaret would criticize my choices and make unexpected visits that weakened my authority in my own home. "Grace," she would sarcastically say, "you ought to redecorate. This house needs a more sophisticated touch." I attempted to be patient since I believed I could tolerate her meddling, but she persisted in berating me. One evening, I approached Trevor to discuss boundaries. "Do you mind if we talk about your mom?" I asked, hoping that he would understand. "I feel suffocated in my own home." Trevor's snide response was, "Grace, she's just trying to help the family. You have to learn to get along with her first." His remarks broke my heart, and I realized then that he would never stand up for me. I felt alone in the location I had put so much effort into making my home. Things only got worse when Margaret decided to move in without telling me. One afternoon when I arrived home, she was unloading her belongings. "I have to be here for my boy," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My objections were unanswered and Trevor declined to intervene. I felt trapped because my sanctuary was disappearing. Then my life took an unexpected turn. I discovered that I was pregnant. I thought that after hearing the news, Trevor and I would grow closer. But Margaret's reaction was anything but joyous. "You should look after yourself," she said coldly. "We cannot afford to experience any issues." Trevor's growing remoteness was even more agonizing than her indifference. As he barely acknowledged the pregnancy, Margaret's grip on our life became more and more firm. The tipping point came one evening after a long day at work. When I arrived home exhausted, the door was locked. I expected Trevor would let me in when I knocked, but Margaret's voice answered, "You're not welcome here, Grace, unless you turn this home over to Trevor." My heart sank when I realized how profoundly they had deceived me. Trevor stood silent and without expression beside his mother. They flung my belongings onto the front lawn as I tried to bargain with them. Trevor shoved me back, tears streaming down my face. I packed up my things and left, feeling broken but determined. I knew I needed to protect myself. I contacted Evelyn Carter, a gifted attorney I had known since college. "Grace will make things right." With firmness, Evelyn said, "They can't take what you've worked so hard for." I moved home with my parents because I was grateful for their unwavering support. My father, a former firefighter, and mother, a devoted housewife, welcomed me with open arms. "There are others around you." "Grace," my father consoled me. "We shall face this together, despite their ease." A deep sensation of loss overcame me. The house around which my dreams had been built was now inhabited by people who had lied to me. But I couldn't let the pain get the better of me. I had to focus on getting back what was rightfully mine. Evelyn wasted no time. The next morning, we met in her office to make a strategy. "First and foremost, we require substantial proof that will demonstrate that you suffered emotional and psychological abuse and that they attempted to coerce you into giving up the house," she stated in a calm yet resolute tone. Her confidence lifted my spirits and gave me hope for the first time in weeks. I began documenting every instance of deception and abuse. I explained how Margaret had taken over my home, undermined my authority, and even invaded my personal space. One afternoon, when I returned home early from work, Margaret was going over my financial records. "What are you doing?" As I demanded, my voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief. Margaret was scarcely surprised. "I'm making sure everything is where it should be," she responded with contempt. "Grace, I need to know you're prepared for the next motherhood." The sheer bravado of her demeanor shocked me. When I pushed Trevor, expecting him to agree with me, he just shrugged. He remarked, "She's just protecting us." I was tricked. Evelyn helped me gather more evidence, including voicemails and texts from Trevor and Margaret and statements from people who had seen the abuse I had experienced firsthand. I began to feel more determined as each piece of information pointed to a story of abuse and control. It wasn't just my house I was fighting for. I was protecting my dignity and the welfare of my unborn kid. I persevered despite the significant emotional toll in the passing of weeks. I discussed my daily issues and the impact of stress on my pregnancy in my journal. I was constantly reminded of my strength and perseverance by my parents, who never left my side. "According to my father, Grace, you've come a long way, and you're stronger than you realize." Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. As soon as I walked into the courthouse, I felt anxious. Evelyn moved beside me across the room, her presence a calming influence. Trevor and Margaret sat confidently, their lawyer whispering in their ears. Although they seemed convinced, I thought the truth was on my side. The judge, a composed woman in her early 50s, brought the proceedings to order. Evelyn spoke up first and outlined our disagreement in detail. "According to her, Your Honor, my client Grace Thompson has been subjected to pressure, emotional abuse, and financial exploitation. We have evidence that her husband and mother-in-law conspired to force her out of her home, endangering both her health and the health of her unborn child." Trevor's lawyer responded quickly, trying to paint me as an unreasonable wife who had exaggerated her claims. "Grace simply isn't willing to compromise," he argued. "Her assertions are baseless, and she is attempting to seize control of shared assets." But Evelyn was prepared. She meticulously described our evidence, which included text messages in which Margaret threatened to call the police on me if I didn't turn over the house, as well as witness testimonials from people who had witnessed their dishonest behavior. The emotional harm that Margaret's invasion of my privacy caused to my pregnancy was further highlighted by her. The judge listened carefully, impartially but attentively. It was then my turn to testify. My hands trembled a little as I stood up, but I took a deep breath and remembered everything I had gone through. I married Trevor because I loved him. Though I had no idea that his mother would move in with me and try to control my life, I began talking steadily. When I tried to set boundaries, I lost my job and was finally locked out of my own house while I was pregnant. This is about more than just money and property. I was mentally devastated and wanted to protect my child. As I spoke, I saw Trevor's cheeks flush and Margaret moved uncomfortably in her chair. As though she was paying attention to everything that was said, the judge's gaze stayed riveted. When Trevor was taken to the stand, he attempted to portray himself as a bewildered husband caught up in a fight. "I just wanted to act as a mediator between my mother and my wife," he stated. However, his speech lacked conviction. After Grace overreacted, we tried to work things out as a family. Margaret followed, though her condescending tone didn't help her. "I simply did what I thought was best for my son and future grandson," she stressed. Grace, who is prone to exaggeration, created unnecessary drama. Evelyn endured relentless cross-examination. She said, "Mrs. Harrison," with firmness, "Do you think it's appropriate to lock a pregnant woman out of her home and force her to give up her property?" Margaret struggled to explain herself, but Evelyn's sharp inquiries exposed the shortcomings in her story. The court called for a little recess. I was both anxious and hopeful as Evelyn and I stepped outside. "You're doing great." She calmed me by squeezing my hand. "We are speaking, and the judge is listening." After the break, We returned to the courtroom for closing arguments. Evelyn stood confidently, her words reverberating throughout the room. Your Honor was the first thing she said. Grace Thompson built a life for herself with tenacity and diligence, but the people she trusted ruined it. The evidence is clear for the most part. Margaret Harrison and Trevor Harrison coerced, mistreated, and exploited Grace in an attempt to seize what was rightfully hers. In this case, property is not the sole concern. It concerns a soon-to-be mother's safety and right to live without fear or control. Despite Trevor's lawyer's final plea, which centered on the fact that family disputes are sometimes complex and that I had overreacted to Margaret's noble intentions, the judge's expression remained stern, and I could see she wasn't convinced. The moment has arrived for the judge to render a decision. She leans forward, her gaze strong and solemn. She said firmly, based on the evidence presented and the testimonies heard today, it is obvious that Grace Thompson has gone through a lot of emotional and psychological suffering. Trevor and Margaret Harrison's conduct was not only dishonest, but they also put Miss Thompson and her unborn child at risk. I am therefore granting Ms. Thompson's sole ownership of her home and full custody of her pregnant child. The judge's next comments gave me relief. Additionally, Mr. Trevor Harrison and Mrs. Margaret Harrison will be required to pay monetary fines. A restraining order will be issued against both defendants in order to safeguard Ms. Thompson, and Mr. Harrison will have to go to mandated counseling sessions. Trevor and Margaret sat down in stunned silence. Margaret was no longer cocky, but astonished and disbelieving. Trevor became white, as if he was disbelieving what was happening. Meanwhile, I felt a rush of emotions, such as relief, triumph, and a sense of justice. I won. Evelyn turned to me, her eyes shining with pride. She said, "You did it elegantly. You can now at last continue after defending yourself." Tears sprang to my eyes, but they were tears of joy. Because I had defended myself and my child, I had won. As I left the courtroom, my parents were waiting for me outside. My mother embraced me and my father said, "We always knew you had it in you," his eyes glistening. "You don't realize how strong you are in the days that followed." I began the process of making a fresh start. With the support of my parents and friends, I went back home and established it as my new sanctuary. I transformed the space into a safe, nurturing environment for my child. The walls, which had once resonated with Margaret's criticism, were now filled with warmth and affection and painted in calming colors. Trevor and Margaret, in the meantime, had to cope with the consequences of their actions. The financial penalties were harsh, and Trevor's reputation suffered as news of the court case circulated. At last, they were no longer able to control me, and Margaret's condescending demeanor had damaged her standing in the neighborhood. One afternoon, Evelyn visited my home. In the now peaceful and comfortable living room, we drank tea and talked about the future. She continued with gratitude, "Grace, you've come so far. You've shown incredible strength." I felt my baby move slowly inside my growing belly as I placed a touch on it. I said, "I've discovered that I'm stronger than I ever imagined. I also want my child to be raised in a caring and secure atmosphere." Evelyn's eyes sparkled with laughter. "Do you have any big goals for the future and what comes next?" I smiled as I thought about the chances I had to keep growing professionally. I may even start my own real estate consulting company someday. But being the best mother I can be is my first priority right now. As the weeks went by, as I prepared for the arrival of my child, I felt hopeful and excited. My parents were thrilled to become grandparents, and their affection surrounded me like a protective shield. I was not a victim anymore. I was ready to face the future with confidence and bravery since I had survived. One night, I sat in the nursery, rocking softly after getting a chair for late-night feedings. I whispered to my unborn kid as the room was flooded with warm, golden light. "You are loved, and you have a strong, brave mother who will always stand up for you." I had fully changed from feeling broken and powerless to standing strong and determined. The journey had been challenging and heartbreaking, but it had also shaped me into a confident woman. I was ready for whatever came next because I felt I had the strength to overcome any challenge.